In the desert of what is now Turkmenistan, there is a city the world forgot twice. Not once, twice. The first time, it simply ended, quietly, around 3,700 years ago, the way most things end. The canals fell out of use, channels shifted, the people left. The sand moved in, the way sand always does, and within a few centuries, there was nothing left above ground to suggest a city had ever been there at all. The second time, it was found, and then it was, in a sense, trapped all over again. Not by sand this time, by language and by the walls the Cold War built between academic worlds. In 1972, a Soviet archaeologist walking a low gray hill in the Karakum Desert picked up a handful of broken pottery. The local name for that hill was Gonur Depe, often translated as Gray Mound, though some sources render it Brown Mound instead. He had no way of knowing yet that he was standing on top of a forgotten Bronze Age civilization, one that built irrigation canals through some of the harshest desert on Earth, raised a palace and temple complex at the heart of a wider settlement that, at its fullest extent, covered about 55 hectares, though the monumental core at its center was considerably smaller, and traded as far as the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia. He spent the next 4 decades excavating it. And for a long time, almost none of it reached the wider English-language public. His findings were published in Russian, in Soviet academic journals that rarely crossed the Iron Curtain, while Western archaeology was busy refining what it already knew about Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. An entire Bronze Age civilization, one large enough to be called, by some scholars, a fourth great civilization of the ancient world, sat almost entirely unknown to English-language scholarship. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union itself had dissolved, that the wider world began to seriously reckon with what had been quietly excavated for 20 years in the desert sands of Turkmenistan. This civilization didn't have a name when it was alive. We don't know what its people called themselves. Today, archaeologists call it the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, a name built from geography, not identity, because identity is one of the many things this civilization never told us. You'll sometimes see it called something else, too. The Oxus Civilization, after the ancient name for the Amu Darya, the great river system around which much of this world took shape. Even the naming is still debated. Some scholars use one term, some the other. A few have proposed broader labels still. Both point toward the same broad cultural world. Neither is a name its people ever gave themselves, and neither proves they were one single people at all. It built cities with the engineering confidence of people who understood water, soil, and scale. It produced, or is at least closely associated with, art so distinctive that related pieces ended up, centuries later, in the collections of the Louvre and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, admired for their craftsmanship by people who had no idea what civilization had made them. It traded across 1,000 miles of mountain and desert, reaching merchants in cities we've spent a century studying. And it may not have had writing at all. Not an undeciphered script, not a mystery language waiting for the right scholar to crack it. Something stranger, a civilization this organized, this far-reaching, that left behind no confirmed local written word, no royal inscriptions in its own language, no administrative records we can read as records of its own making. almost no trace of the one invention we tend to assume any sufficiently complex society must eventually reach for. This is the story of a civilization discovered twice, and still, in some ways, barely known at all. Let's begin where it began, in the sand. In 1972, a Soviet archaeologist named Viktor Saryanidi was walking across a low gray mound in the Karakum Desert of Turkmenistan, in a region the local people called Gonur Depe, often translated as Gray Mound, sometimes Brown Mound, depending on the source. He bent down and picked up a piece of broken pottery. It was an unremarkable gesture. Archaeologists do this constantly, in deserts all over the world, and most of the time it leads nowhere. A scatter of old pottery on a windswept hill could mean almost anything. A small camp, a forgotten way station, a few seasons of habitation centuries ago, and nothing more. This time, it meant something else entirely. Saryanidi was not a stranger to this region. Born in Tashkent in 1929 to a family of Pontic Greek descent, he had already spent 2 decades working across Soviet Central Asia and northern Afghanistan, slowly building a reputation as one of the few archaeologists willing to take this part of the world seriously. Most of Western archaeology in the mid-20th century had its attention fixed firmly on Egypt, on Mesopotamia, on the Indus Valley. Central Asia was, to most of the field, a corridor, a place nomads passed through on their way to somewhere else, not a place where civilizations began. Saryanidi suspected otherwise. It would take him 2 more years to begin proper excavation. He was occupied elsewhere, in the Kopet Dagh Mountains and other corners of the ancient Murghab River Delta in Afghanistan, and Gonur Depe had to wait its turn. Formal excavation began in 1974, and once it did not stop. Saryanidi would return to that gray hill season after season for nearly 40 years. What he uncovered, piece by piece, decade by decade, was not a campsite. It was a city. A fortified palace, a ritual or temple complex, including features Saryanidi interpreted as fire altars. Mudbrick walls reinforced with rectangular towers, enclosing a citadel roughly 100 meters by 180. Surrounding it, more than 20 satellite settlements. Surrounding those, an irrigation network that had once carried water from the Murghab River out into fields that, by the time Saryanidi arrived, had long since returned to desert. At its fullest extent, the site Saryanidi was excavating covered some 55 hectares, a city built against all odds in one of the harshest stretches of desert on the planet. He named what he'd found the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, after the 2 ancient regions, Bactria and Margiana, where its settlements were concentrated. Today, most people who study it simply call it BMAC. Saryanidi himself believed he had found something larger than a single lost city. He argued throughout his career that the Amu Darya River Valley, the ancient Oxus, represented a 4th cradle of urban civilization, standing alongside the Nile, the Indus, and the Tigris and Euphrates. A bold claim, not one every scholar has accepted, but not a claim made lightly either, made by a man who had spent 4 decades with his hands in that soil, watching one structure after another emerge from underneath it. Here is the part of the story that should by now sound strange to you. Almost none of this reached the wider world for nearly 20 years. Sarianidi was Soviet. His funding was Soviet. His academic institutions were Soviet. And in the 1970s and 1980s, that meant his findings were published almost exclusively in Russian, in Soviet academic journals that rarely made their way past the Iron Curtain, and almost never into the English-language scholarship that Western universities, museums, and the wider public actually read. Think about what that means. While Western archaeology spent those same 2 decades refining what it already knew, going deeper into Egypt, deeper into Mesopotamia, deeper into the Indus Valley, an entire Bronze Age civilization with cities, irrigation systems, temples, and trade routes stretching 1,000 miles in every direction was being excavated in real time, documented, photographed, catalogued. And for decades, almost none of it entered the English-language archaeological mainstream. It wasn't secrecy, exactly. Sarianidi wasn't hiding anything. He published. He gave conference papers. Within Soviet archaeology, he was respected, even, by some accounts, considered something of a legend, known as much for his findings as for a famously blunt, uncompromising personality. But publishing in Russian, inside the Soviet academic system, during the Cold War, functioned almost as effectively as a wall. The information existed. It simply could not easily cross. That changed only after 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved. Its archives became more accessible, and Western scholars, slowly, and not without some skepticism at first, began to seriously engage with what Sarianidi had spent 2 decades documenting. Translations followed. International collaborations followed. The Margiana archaeological expedition itself became a joint Russian-Turkmen project, continuing the work after Sarianidi's death in 2013 under new leadership, still excavating Gonur Depe to this day. By then, the story had already taken its strangest turn, not the city emerging from the sand after 37 centuries, but a city extensively excavated, carefully documented, fully real, while most of the world remained almost completely unaware it existed. Among everything Sarianidi and the expeditions that followed him would eventually uncover, seals, vessels, jewelry, and the more puzzling ritual objects we'll come to later, a handful of individual artifacts would go on to matter more than almost anything else recovered from BMAC soil. Not necessarily the most beautiful objects, not always the ones that ended up photographed for museum catalogs, the ones that, in some cases, quietly answered questions about who this civilization was talking to, 3,700 years before anyone thought to ask. We'll meet those objects properly later in this story. For now, it's enough to know they exist, because the most famous things this civilization left behind, and the most important things it left behind, are not always the same objects. That tension runs through almost everything we know about BMAC, starting with the city Sarianidi spent his life uncovering. Let's go there now. To understand what Sarianidi found at Gonur Depe, you first have to understand what should not have been there at all. This is the Karakum Desert, one of the driest, harshest stretches of land in Central Asia. Summer temperatures climb past 50 degrees Celsius. Rainfall is scarce, unreliable, and in most years, close to meaningless for agriculture. By any reasonable expectation, this is not a place where a city should be able to feed itself, let alone support monumental architecture and a network of settlements across multiple generations. And yet it did, for roughly 700 years. The answer lies in a river most people have never heard of. The Murghab rises far to the south, in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, fed by snowmelt and glacier runoff rather than rainfall. It flows north into the desert, and rather than reaching any sea, it simply spreads out and disappears into an enormous inland delta, one of the largest in Central Asia, even today. That delta is where the people we now call the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex chose to build. They didn't simply settle near the river and hope for the best. They dug canals, extending out from the Murghab's channels into the surrounding land, diverting its water into fields that would otherwise have remained barren desert. Because the river's flow depended on mountain snowmelt rather than local rainfall, the water supply was, in a sense, more dependable than it would have been almost anywhere else in the region. Drought in the desert did not necessarily mean drought in the fields, as long as the canals kept running and the mountains kept their snow. The crops this system supported tell their own story. Archaeobotanists working at Togolok, one of BMAC's other major sites, have recovered tens of thousands of preserved plant remains from the period. Barley, free-threshing wheat, peas, lentils, even grapes, and what may be early plums. This was not subsistence farming clinging to survival. This was a deliberately diversified agricultural system, capable of supporting surplus, trade, and a population large enough to build what came next. It's easy, telling this story, to drift toward palaces and seals and forget that most daily life here happened far from either. Their world was not only temples and trade goods. In the fields surrounding these settlements, ordinary people grew barley and wheat, stored legumes through the winter, tended vines for grapes, and very possibly gathered or cultivated fruit, plums, perhaps apples or pears, growing wherever the canals reached. None of this happened by accident. A desert city does not feed itself through luck. It takes generations of accumulated knowledge about exactly where water needs to go, and exactly when. Which points to something worth sitting with for a moment. In a place like this, power wasn't only held behind palace walls. It was held in the canals themselves, in who decided which fields got water this season, who maintained which channel, who had the authority to make those decisions when the river ran low. Controlling water in a landscape like this was a form of holding a desert together by hand. That kind of authority doesn't announce itself the way a throne room does, but it may have mattered just as much. What came next was Gonur Depe itself. At its height, the site sprawled across some 55 hectares, roughly the size of a small town center, though town undersells what was actually there. At its core stood a fortified citadel, its mud-brick walls reinforced with rectangular towers, enclosing a structure large enough that archaeologists still refer to it, without exaggeration, as a palace. Surrounding the citadel, more than 20 satellite settlements spread out across the delta, connected by the same network of canals that fed the fields between them. This was not one city standing alone in the desert. It was the anchor of an entire settled landscape. By some counts, more than 200 settlements across the wider Margiana region, all dependent, in one way or another, on the water Gonur Depe's builders had learned to control. Approach the palace complex itself, and you encounter something that archaeologists did not expect to find this far from Mesopotamia or the Indus. A deliberate, engineered relationship with water that went well beyond simple irrigation. Large pools, fed by the same canal system, surrounded the approach to the palace. Excavators have found the remains of what appears to be a purpose-built filtration structure nearby. A mudbrick construction with openings set at different heights, apparently designed to let water pass through layers of plant material before collecting in a separate, cleaner pool. Sarianidi and the archaeologists who have continued his work argue that this was more than practical engineering, that no one entered the palace complex without passing through these waters first, and that the cleaned water in particular was reserved for ritual use. That second part, the ritual interpretation, is Sarianidi's reading, not an uncontested fact, and it's worth saying so plainly. Sarianidi spent much of his career arguing that Gonur Depe's water features, fire altars, and ceremonial architecture pointed toward an early, localized ancestor of what would later become Zoroastrian religious practice. To be clear, that's not the same as saying Zoroastrianism itself existed here. The safer claim is that some of what was built and practiced here may parallel or anticipate much later Indo-Iranian religious patterns, not that those later traditions were already fully formed. Some of his colleagues found the comparison compelling. Others have pushed back hard, arguing he sometimes built more certainty into his interpretations than the physical evidence alone could support. What's secure is the engineering itself. The pools, the canals, the filtration structure are real, excavated, and documented. What people were actually doing as they passed through that water is something we can reasonably infer, but cannot prove. Beyond the palace and its pools, Gonur Depe was also, unmistakably, a working city. Workshop areas have turned up evidence of bronze casting, bead production, and pottery manufacture on a scale that implies organized, specialized labor, not unlike what we'd expect from any Bronze Age urban center built around trade and craft. And trade is where BMAC's story stops being purely local. This city, sitting in the middle of one of the harshest deserts on the planet, was not isolated. Its location placed it almost exactly between two of the ancient world's great centers of civilization, Mesopotamia to the west, the Indus Valley to the southeast, and the objects recovered from Gonur Depe's graves and palace floors make clear that its people knew this and used it. Imported goods from the Iranian plateau have turned up in BMAC contexts. So have objects whose style and material point unmistakably toward Mesopotamia, a civilization more than 1,000 miles to the west. And in at least one case, archaeologists found something that required no stylistic guesswork at all: an actual Harappan stamp seal carrying genuine Indus script, excavated directly from Gonur Depe's soil. Not a local imitation, not a vague cultural echo. A real object made in the Indus Valley itself that had somehow traveled across mountains and deserts to end up buried in a city most of the modern world had never heard of until the 1990s. One of the most evocative materials moving through this world was lapis lazuli, a deep, impossible blue stone most likely quarried in the Badakhshan Mountains of what is now northeastern Afghanistan. To Bronze Age elites across Mesopotamia, Iran, and the Indus world, This stone was a prestige material almost without rival, rare, luminous, and distant enough to carry the weight of another world entirely. Archaeologists sometimes call the routes this stone traveled the lapis lazuli route, a kind of proto-Silk Road network of luxury exchange, centuries before silk gave its name to anything. BMAC did not control that network on its own, the clearest evidence for actually processing raw lapis into finished goods points further south and west to sites in eastern Iran. But the Oxus world sat directly inside this network's geography, close to the Afghan source, connected by trade to Iran and the Indus, positioned exactly where blue stone, metal, seals, and ivory could move from hand to hand across the ancient world. A related class of object tells a similar story. Archaeologists have a name for a particular style of carved stone vessel, dark, soft chlorite stone, etched with mountains, palm trees, and strange hybrid animal figures that circulated across this same Bronze Age interaction zone. They call it, fittingly, the intercultural style. These vessels were made mainly in southern Iran and the Gulf, not in BMAC itself, and from there they traveled outward, turning up everywhere from Mesopotamian temples to sites along the edge of the Indus world. BMAC didn't produce them, but its location, sitting at the crossroads between the Iranian plateau and the Indus Valley, placed it inside the same broad artistic and commercial conversation that carried those vessels from one end of the Bronze Age world to the other. We'll spend more time with that seal, and with a handful of other individual objects that tell BMAC's trade story even more precisely, later in this video. For now, the broader point is enough. A civilization built in conditions that should have made even basic survival difficult, instead became a hub, a place where Mesopotamian craftsmanship, Indus Valley sealing practices, and the raw materials of the Iranian plateau all converged. In a desert delta most people still cannot find on a map. Whoever ran this place understood water, understood trade, and understood how to turn one of the least forgiving landscapes on Earth into the center of a network stretching halfway across the ancient world. But understanding what they built is only part of the story. The harder question, the one the evidence answers far less completely, is who exactly these people actually were. If you searched right now for an image of this civilization, typed its name into any search engine and looked at what comes back, there's a good chance the very first result would be a face that has nothing to do with Gonur Depe at all. She's known, informally, as the Bactrian princess. A small seated or squatting composite figure, carved from green chlorite or steatite and pale calcite, wearing what looks like a heavy woolen robe, her hands folded with quiet, deliberate composure. She's become, more than any single object, the face of this civilization in museum catalogs and art history textbooks around the world. The Louvre has one. So does the Metropolitan Museum of Art in a related form. So do private collections and smaller museums scattered across multiple continents. By some counts, something like 40 examples of this figure type are known today. Here is the uncomfortable part. For most of these figures, we have almost no idea where they actually came from. The Louvre's example, acquired in 1969, and today one of the most recognizable single objects associated with this civilization, has no excavation record at all. Its documented history begins the moment it entered the museum's collection. Before that, nothing. Just Bactria, a region, not a site, not a grave, not a context. The same is true for most of the other examples scattered across the world's museums. They surfaced through the antiquities market, sometime in the 20th century, with no archaeologist present to record where they'd been resting for 37 centuries before someone dug them up and sold them. This is not a minor footnote. It means that the single most famous visual symbol of this entire civilization is also one of the least understood objects associated with it. We can describe what she looks like in extraordinary detail. We cannot say with any confidence which city she came from, which grave she was buried in, or what role she played in the lives of the people who made her. There are at least two exceptions, and they matter. Among the controlled excavations at Gonur Depe, archaeologists eventually recovered two examples of this same figure type still in their original burial context. One in a male burial, less completely preserved, and one fully intact figure, found resting at the head of a female burial. That second one is the find that matters most. It's the only fully preserved example of this figure type, out of perhaps 40 known worldwide, that anyone has actually excavated in place, still positioned exactly where it was left, in a grave we can study rather than a museum acquisition record that starts with a purchase. The burial itself appears, from its context, to belong to a woman of some standing, though the evidence supports probably high status, rather than anything more definite like noble or royal. So who was she, the woman buried with that figure, and the countless others like her whose names and stories we'll never recover? This is where the evidence gets thinner, and where I want to be honest with you about the limits of what archaeology can actually tell us. We know fragments. We know that Gonur Depe's necropolis alone contains more than 3,000 graves, ranging from simple pit burials to elaborate underground chambers stocked with gold, silver, ivory, and imported luxury goods, meaning this was a society with real, visible differences in wealth and status, not an egalitarian one. We know, from a major genetic study published in 2019, that the core population of this civilization traced its ancestry primarily to local populations descended from Iranian Neolithic farmers, with no significant ancestry from the Eurasian steppe at all, at least not yet. That same study found a handful of individual outliers buried at these sites, starting around 2100 BC, who did carry steppe-related ancestry. The first genetic trace of contact with the populations who would, centuries later, become central to this civilization's story. We know they farmed, organized labor into specialized workshops, and built a civilization sophisticated enough to negotiate trade relationships with two of the ancient world's true superpowers. And it's in that trade relationship, not in any single grand monument, that some of the most quietly remarkable objects this civilization left behind come into focus. Remember the seal I mentioned earlier, the one we promised to come back to? In excavations at Gonur Depe North, archaeologists recovered a small stone stamp seal carrying both an image of an elephant and a short inscription in genuine Indus script, the same undeciphered writing system associated with the Indus Valley Civilization, more than 1,000 miles to the southeast. Specialists who've examined it conclude it was very likely manufactured in the Indus region itself, not copied or imitated locally, and then carried here, to a desert city in Turkmenistan, where it was eventually lost or deposited and stayed buried for roughly 37 centuries. Think about what that single object actually represents. Not a stylistic echo, not two cultures that happened to develop similar artistic tastes independently. A real, physical, manufactured object, produced in one civilization, transported across deserts and mountain passes, and ending up in the soil of another. Someone carried it, someone traded it, or gifted it, or lost it. The seal doesn't prove that a merchant from the Indus Valley personally stood inside Gonur Depe's walls. It may well have passed through other hands along the way. But it proves something almost as powerful: that the exchange networks linking these two worlds were real enough and active enough to carry a small inscribed object across 1,000 miles of mountain and desert. They weren't only talking to the Indus Valley, either. In one of the graves in Gonur's necropolis, excavators found a cylinder seal made of dolomite, inscribed in cuneiform, a script belonging not to the Indus world, but to Mesopotamia, more than 1,000 miles in the opposite direction. Specialists who've studied the inscription read it as a fairly standard Sumerian or Akkadian text, and its imagery, a hero locked in combat with a lion and a bull, echoes artistic conventions from the Mesopotamian world of roughly the 22nd century BC. Part of the inscription appears to identify its original owner by an official title: a cupbearer, a servant, language some scholars read as indicating a position of real status at a royal court, not a casual household object. How a personal seal belonging to a Mesopotamian court official ended up buried in a grave in the Karakum Desert is a question nobody can fully answer. But the most likely explanations all point toward the same conclusion: trade, diplomacy, or some kind of personal movement between these worlds that we have no written record of, because, as we'll see shortly, this is a civilization that may not have kept written records at all. So this is the strange position BMAC's individual artifacts leave us in. The objects everyone recognizes, the Bactrian princess, displayed in glass cases in Paris and New York, are, for the most part, severed from their original context, beautiful but largely unmoored from the story of any particular life. The objects almost no one outside specialist archaeology has ever heard of: a small stamp seal with an elephant on it, a cylinder seal naming a long-dead cupbearer, are the ones quietly proving, about as clearly as Bronze Age evidence ever allows, that this civilization was deeply, physically connected to two of the great powers of the ancient world. The famous face of this civilization and the objects that actually explain it turn out to be two different things entirely. And there's one more object worth knowing about before we move on. Not famous, not yet widely known even within archaeology, but recent enough and strange enough that it deserves a moment of its own. In 2019, in a grave at a smaller settlement near Gonur, archaeologists uncovered fragments of a painted wooden panel, plastered, pigmented in black, red, and ochre, showing what appears to be a human figure with an arm extended, possibly holding a snake. It's the first confirmed example of polychrome painting, actual painted imagery, not carved or inlaid, ever recovered from this civilization's territory. The grave around it belonged to a woman. 16 ceramic vessels were found with her in total, 11 placed together in a small cyst, 5 more positioned to the west of her body, along with a bronze hairpin set with turquoise and lapis lazuli, and a small carved limestone foot whose purpose no one has confidently explained. We don't know her name. We don't know what the painted figure on that panel meant to her or to the people who buried her with it. But for one brief moment, in a grave that sat undisturbed for 3,700 years, this civilization left behind something closer to an image than anything else we have, a person painted by another person, for reasons that died with both of them. That's about as close as the evidence lets us get to the individual lives behind this civilization. For the larger questions, what they believed, whether they wrote anything down at all, and what really happened in the rooms where Sarianidi claimed to find traces of a sacred ritual drink, we have to leave the graves behind and step into far more contested territory. If you've spent any time with stories of lost civilizations, you've probably absorbed a certain kind of mystery without even realizing it. A civilization builds great cities. It develops a writing system. And then, somehow, that writing system is lost to time, leaving behind inscriptions that stare back at us, unreadable, daring modern scholars to crack the code. That is not this civilization's mystery. This civilization's mystery is stranger, and in some ways is harder to sit with. It isn't that we have writing and can't read it. It's that, after more than half a century of excavation across dozens of sites, archaeologists have found almost no evidence that this civilization developed and used a writing system of its own. Think about how unusual that actually is. This was a civilization with a fortified palace, organized labor, long-distance trade routes reaching Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, and a settlement network spanning hundreds of sites across an entire river delta. Many of the Bronze Age societies we instinctively compare it to: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley itself, used writing or formal sign systems to manage exactly that kind of administrative and commercial complexity. Here, by contrast, the local evidence remains almost entirely silent. Almost. On May 31st in the year 2000, an archaeologist named Frederick Hebert was excavating at a site called Anau, not far from the Bactria Margiana world, when he uncovered something small enough to miss if you weren't looking closely. A tiny seal, barely larger than a fingernail, carved from polished black stone, engraved with 5 distinct symbols and traces of a reddish pigment pressed into the grooves. Radiocarbon dating placed the layer it came from at roughly 4,000 years old, squarely within this civilization's lifetime. Here is where I have to be careful, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets exaggerated the moment it leaves academic circles. Hebert, the archaeologist who actually found it, did not announce that he'd discovered a lost writing system. His own published assessment was considerably more restrained, that the seal most likely reflected a local symbolic system, the kind of mark an administrator might use to track goods moving through a temple, a barracks, or a palace storeroom. A label, in other words, not literature, not even necessarily writing in the full sense of the word. The excitement came later from outside observers comparing those 5 symbols to far later Chinese writing traditions, pointing out that one symbol bears some resemblance to an early form of a Chinese character. At least one prominent Chinese historian who examined the seal noted that its shape and form share no resemblance to seals from Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, leaving its origins genuinely puzzling. But resembles a much later symbol from an entirely different region, by coincidence or convergent design, is a very different claim from "this proves a writing system existed here." The honest summary is this: one object, 5 marks, one excavator urging caution, and a debate among specialists that remains unresolved a quarter-century later. Outside of that single seal, the absence holds. No royal inscriptions in a language of its own, no administrative tablets, no long-sealed texts of the kind found at Mesopotamian sites just 1,000 miles away. A civilization that built canals across a desert, ran trade routes spanning continents, and apparently did all of it without ever needing, or choosing, to develop a local writing system at all. But absence of writing doesn't mean absence of administration. Seals are exactly the kind of tool a society can use to track goods, mark ownership, or control access, even without writing a single word of text. You don't need to be able to read a mark for it to function as authority. It's entirely possible this civilization tracked its trade, its storerooms, and its authority just as carefully as its literate neighbors did, just not in a language anyone could read back, maybe not in language at all. That's the first mystery. The second one is, if anything, more dramatic and considerably more contested. In the early 1990s, Victor Sarianides' excavations at Gonur's temple complex and at a related site called Togolok turned up a series of rooms his team came to call the White Rooms, chambers lined with small platforms, each fitted with vessels carved from thick gypsum, sunk directly into the walls. Nearby, his team recovered large vats with perforated bottoms, alongside grinding stones, mortars, and ceramic strainers, equipment that, taken together, looks very much like a system for pressing and filtering some kind of plant material. In 1994, Sarianidi announced that residue testing on these vessels had revealed traces of ephedra and poppy. A few years later, testing at a second related site reportedly turned up ephedra, poppy, and cannabis together. To Sarianidi, this was not just an interesting botanical detail. It was potential physical evidence for something described in 2 of the oldest religious texts in the world. The Rig Veda, one of the foundational texts of what would become Hinduism, describes a sacred ritual drink called soma, consumed by priests, praised across dozens of hymns, its exact ingredients never clearly specified. The Avesta, the foundational text of Zoroastrianism, describes a closely related ritual drink under a cognate name, Haoma. Both traditions trace back, in different ways, to peoples who lived somewhere in this broader Central Asian and Iranian world during the centuries after this civilization declined. If Sarianidi was right, he might have found physical proof of the actual ingredients behind one of the oldest religious rituals still echoing in modified form through living traditions today. It would have been a genuinely extraordinary find. The strongest version of that claim did not hold up. In 1995, an independent researcher tested the first batch of specimens Sarianidi had provided and could not confirm his findings. Then, in 2002 and 2003, 3 separate independent research teams analyzed material from the second site. The one Sarianidi said had yielded ephedra, poppy, and cannabis together. and none of them found traces of any of the three substances. One of those researchers went further, examining the plant impressions directly. What she found was a far less exotic candidate. Broomcorn millet, an ordinary cereal grain, fit the physical evidence better than any of Sarianides' proposed ritual plants. Sarianides did not simply accept this. His response, on record, was that the negative results came from samples that had spent 5 years exposed to direct sun, rain, and snow before they were finally retested. Degradation, he argued, that could easily have destroyed whatever residue had once been there. It's a reasonable point about preservation in principle. It is also, notably, not something that can be tested or verified after the fact. The original residue, if it ever existed, is simply gone either way. There's a more mundane possibility worth knowing about, too. The perforated vessels at the center of this whole debate, the ones interpreted as Soma Haoma strainers, closely resemble equipment used elsewhere in Central Asia for an entirely unrelated purpose: making cheese. Straining curds from whey requires exactly the kind of perforated vessel found in these white rooms. It's entirely possible the equipment is real, the ritual function is real, and the specific plants are simply unconfirmed. Or it's possible the rooms had nothing to do with a sacred drink at all, and the resemblance to Soma preparation equipment is coincidental. Nobody has definitively settled this one way or the other. Sarianides maintained his interpretation until his death in 2013. Other archaeologists remain skeptical. The chemistry, as it currently stands, does not support the claim, but the architecture, the equipment, and the timing all line up in a way that keeps the question alive rather than closed. So here is where this civilization actually leaves us. No confirmed writing system, despite trade routes stretching 1,000 miles in either direction. A contested, unresolved claim about a sacred ritual drink that may or may not have been brewed in rooms built specifically for that purpose. A people who built one of the most sophisticated desert irrigation systems of the ancient Bronze Age world, and who, as far as the evidence currently shows, may have done it all while keeping nothing written down. No names, no laws, no prayers, nothing we can read, possibly because there was nothing to read in the first place. Which leaves one question still unanswered. If they left so little explanation behind for how they lived, what, if anything, can the evidence tell us about how it all came to an end? Civilizations are supposed to end with drama, a war, a famine, an invasion you can point to on a map with a date attached and a villain at the center of it. This one didn't end that way. As far as the evidence currently shows, it simply got quieter. Around 3,900 years ago, roughly 1900 BC, give or take a century depending on which site you're measuring, the great walled centers of this civilization began shrinking, not collapsing overnight, shrinking. Gonur Depe and its sister sites had spent centuries growing larger, more fortified, more elaborate. Then, gradually, that growth simply stopped and started running in reverse. At almost exactly the same time, the archaeological record starts showing something else: pottery belonging to a very different cultural tradition, associated with mobile, pastoral peoples from the Eurasian steppe to the north, a group archaeologists call the Andronovo culture, and more specifically, in this context, a related group known as Tazabagyab. This pottery doesn't just appear outside the walls, in herding camps where you might expect to find evidence of nomadic neighbors passing through. It appears inside the settlements, alongside the existing BMAC pottery, in the same households, the same period, the same physical space. That detail matters because it complicates the simplest version of this story, the one where nomadic raiders sweep down from the steppe and the great cities fall. What the evidence actually shows looks less like conquest and more like contact, beginning even earlier than the decline itself, intensifying around 2000 BC and continuing for generations afterward. Some of these steppe-descended people appear, in time, to have settled down themselves, adopting the very irrigation agriculture this civilization had spent centuries perfecting. Two ways of life, blending together, rather than one simply replacing the other at the point of a spear. So, if it wasn't conquest, what was it? One major explanation worth taking seriously is environmental and hydrological, though it's worth saying up front that this isn't a settled, single-cause story. This entire civilization depended on a fragile thread, river water, channeled through canals, sustaining agriculture in a landscape that could not have supported large populations any other way. The Murghab Delta, fed by mountain snowmelt rather than direct rainfall, was always vulnerable to changes happening far upstream. In mountains, its people never saw and couldn't control. A shift in the river's course, a change in canal maintenance, a slow decline in the water reliably reaching the delta, any of these could undermine an irrigation-dependent civilization gradually, without a single dramatic event behind it. At least one detailed study of the region's paleoclimate has pushed back against the idea of one sudden, drastic climate event being solely responsible for this civilization's decline, arguing the actual environmental data doesn't clearly support that simpler story. What seems more likely is something messier: local environmental change, the slow burden of maintaining canals across generations and increasing contact with neighboring peoples, all overlapping rather than any single cause delivering one final blow. It's worth saying plainly that this isn't settled with certainty. Climate, river migration, and nomadic contact are not three competing explanations where only one can be right. They may well be three pieces of a single, intertwined story. Environmental pressure making the old way of life harder to sustain, populations dispersing and mixing with steppe neighbors as a result. The whole system unwinding gradually, rather than any one cause delivering a final blow. By around 1700 to 1600 BC, the great period of monumental BMAC settlement was effectively over. The canals that had turned desert into farmland fell into disrepair or were abandoned outright. The fortified palace-temple complexes that had stood for centuries were left to the sand. Within a few hundred years, much of what had been built, the walls, the water systems, the workshops, was buried deep enough that it would take another 3,500 years before anyone looked at a gray, windswept hill near the Murghab and thought to wonder what might be underneath it. But here is something worth sitting with before we close this story. Gone is not quite the same as erased. A serious, ongoing line of scholarship, built carefully over decades by linguists, including Michael Witzel and Alexander Lubotsky, argues that this civilization's language may have left fingerprints on two of the ancient world's most important religious traditions, even after the cities themselves had emptied. To be clear about what this is and isn't, nobody has identified or deciphered the actual language this civilization spoke. What Lubotsky has identified instead is a cluster of words found in early Indo-Aryan, especially Vedic Sanskrit itself, with no clear origin anywhere else in the broader Indo-European language family. His hypothesis is that these words were absorbed from a now unknown substrate language, encountered by early Indo-Iranian speakers in or near this delta, by people whose cities had already begun to empty by the time their words started showing up in hymns composed somewhere else entirely. Some of the same loanwords, intriguingly, have even turned up in Tocharian, a now extinct language once spoken far to the east in what is now Western China. If this reconstruction is right, this civilization may have survived not only in ruins and excavated objects, but in borrowed words, fragments of a lost language, never identified, never decoded, hiding in plain sight inside languages people still study today. This connects back to something we touched on earlier, the Soma and Hyoma traditions, the sacred ritual drinks described in the Rig Veda and the Avesta, the disputed residue found in those gypsum-lined white rooms. Whatever the truth of that specific chemical claim, the broader cultural link is taken seriously by serious scholars. The religious traditions that eventually produced both of those texts trace their roots back, at least in part, to peoples who spent time in or near this world, before scattering outward into northern India and the Iranian plateau. Here's where the genetics actually complicate this story in an interesting way. A major ancient DNA study found no detectable steppe pastoralist-derived ancestry in the BMAC groups it sampled for most of this civilization's history. These were, genetically, two separate worlds for centuries. But starting around 2100 BC, overlapping with, not following, the period of contraction we just described, individual outliers buried at BMAC sites begin showing up with steppe-related ancestry. Not a flood, not a population replacement. A handful of individuals, appearing earlier than you might expect, woven into the same communities as everyone else. That ancestry would go on to spread much farther south into South Asia over the following centuries. But here, in this delta, the genetic story isn't a wave that arrived after the civilization ended. It's a thread that was already being woven in while the cities were still, however quietly, coming apart. So perhaps that's the most honest way to think about how this civilization actually ended. Not a fall, a fade into the steppe cultures that mingled with its people, into languages carried by migrants who may never have known they were carrying anything at all, and eventually into ritual traditions still recognizable, in however transformed a way, in texts people study and recite even now. The cities themselves went silent. The canals dried out or were abandoned. The palace at Gonur Depe filled slowly with sand, year after year, until there was nothing left above ground to suggest a city had ever stood there. And then, in 1972, a man walking across a gray hill in the Karakum Desert bent down, picked up a piece of broken pottery, and started asking questions nobody had thought to ask in over 3,000 years. We still don't have all the answers. We may never have most of them. There's no deciphered language to translate, no royal archive to read. No single voice from this civilization that has ever spoken to us directly in its own words. But we have the canals they dug by hand through some of the harshest desert on Earth. We have the seals that crossed 1,000 miles to end up in graves we've only just opened. We have a woman buried with a small carved figure resting near her head in a city whose name she would not recognize, speaking a language no living person has ever heard spoken. And the story isn't finished. Excavations at Gonur Depe have continued well into this century, under Turkmen and Russian archaeologists carrying the work forward, which means this civilization is still, quite literally, being uncovered. Somewhere in that delta, right now, there may be a grave, a seal, a painted fragment, still waiting in the sand for someone to find it. That's not nothing. That's a civilization reaching forward across 37 centuries of silence in the only language it has left, the things it built and the things it buried, waiting for someone patient enough to dig. Thank you for drifting with us tonight. New journeys every week.